Tsutomu Miyazaki's story is one of the darkest and most disturbing in Japan's modern history. On the surface, he was just another quiet, socially isolated young man. But behind closed doors, he was harboring an obsession and a darkness that would eventually lead him to commit some of the most horrific crimes the country had ever seen. From the very beginning, Tsutomu's life was marked by suffering. He was born with a severe deformity. His hands were fused to his wrists, meaning he could not bend them properly. This strange, claw-like appearance made him a target for relentless bullying at school. Instead of sympathy, he faced ridicule, alienation, and rejection. At home, things weren't any better. His father barely spoke to him. His younger sisters considered him repulsive, and even within his own family, Tsutomu felt like an outcast. Making friends was impossible. Dating was out of the question. He lived a life of crushing loneliness. Then, as if his existence wasn't already complicated enough, Tsutomu eventually discovered a devastating truth. The woman he believed was his mother was not his biological mother at all. He was, in fact, the child of his father and his father's older sister. A revelation that both explained his deformity and deepened his sense of alienation. It was a twisted family secret that only fueled his growing resentment and misery. With no real human connection in his life, Tsutomu retreated into a world of fantasy. He buried himself in manga, anime, horror movies, and adult films. At first, it was an escape, but like any addiction, he soon became desensitized. The more he consumed, the more extreme his tastes became. Normal entertainment no longer satisfied him. He needed to level up. In college, this obsession began manifesting in disturbing ways. He was caught taking photos of female tennis players, zooming in on their crotches. Soon after, his behavior escalated. He secretly watched one of his sisters bathe. When she caught him and lashed out, he became violent. He also lashed out at his mother when she begged him to stop wasting his life on endless videos. By his early 20s, his fantasies had warped into something even darker. At age 22, he became addicted to child pornography. Mixing this perverse interest with his obsession for violent horror films depicting torture. It was a dangerous cocktail, and by 26, Tsutomu Miyazaki began his descent into real-world violence. His first victim was a 4-year-old girl named Mari Kano. On a summer day in 1988, he lured little Mari away and drove her to a hiking trail. But when Mari began to cry and make noises, Tsutomu panicked. In a cruel and desperate act, he placed his hands around her tiny neck and strangled her until she stopped breathing. Once she was dead, he stripped her and violated her lifeless body. Then he left her small corpse to decompose in the wilderness. But this was only the beginning. Over the next year, Miyazaki abducted and murdered 3 more little girls: Masami Yoshizawa, Erika Namba, and Ayako Nomoto. The pattern was chilling. He would lure them away, strangle them, sexually abuse their corpses, take photos, and sometimes even keep their clothes as twisted trophies. But like the villains in the horror films he adored, Miyazaki wasn't content with just killing. He began escalating. He returned to some of the bodies, mutilating them, cutting off hands and feet, even burning or consuming pieces of their remains. And he didn't stop there. He turned his cruelty onto the families of his victims. Like something out of a horror movie, he began tormenting them directly. He made strange, silent phone calls, where all the grieving families could hear was his eerie breathing on the other end. He mailed them boxes containing their children's ashes, bones, or teeth. He sent photographs of their daughter's clothing. He even mailed postcards with cryptic, taunting words: Mari, bone, cremated, investigate, proof, Erica, cold, cough, throat, rest, death. The twisted theatrics were as if he wanted to be caught, or as if he was trying to make himself into a horror character, a real-life villain performing for the world. But like many criminals who grow overconfident, his downfall came when he pushed too far. In 1989, he attempted to abduct 2 sisters, but this time, one of them managed to escape and raise the alarm. Police quickly tracked him down and arrested him before he could flee. When investigators searched his home, what they uncovered shocked Japan. His tiny, cluttered apartment contained nearly 6,000 videotapes, a mix of horror films, pornography, and recordings of his crimes. They even found preserved remains of his victims, including the severed hands and feet of little Marikono. The media soon gave him a name, the Otaku Murderer. To many, he embodied the darkest fears of Japan's growing subculture of obsessive manga and anime fans. But for his family, the shame was unbearable. Miyazaki's father, horrified by what his son had done, refused to hire a lawyer to defend him. During his trial, Miyazaki showed no remorse. Instead, he blamed everything on an alter ego he claimed lived inside him, a creature he called Rat Man. He even wrote angry letters from prison, lashing out at his father and blaming him for his life of misery. The trial lasted 7 long years, but eventually, justice came. In 1997, Tsutomu Miyazaki was sentenced to death. He remained on death row for more than a decade until, in 2008, his sentence was carried out. The crimes of Tsutomu Miyazaki shocked Japan to its core. They weren't just brutal murders. They were crimes designed to instill terror, to linger in the minds of families and investigators forever. He wasn't just killing children, he was destroying families, playing psychological games, and feeding off the fear he created. His story is a reminder of the dangers of unchecked obsession, isolation, and the way a broken childhood can warp into something unthinkable. Miyazaki went from a lonely, bullied boy to one of the most infamous monsters in Japan's history. And to this day, his crimes remain among the most haunting examples of how darkness can grow, unchecked in the shadows of society. Jeffrey Dahmer, a name that has become synonymous with horror. To his neighbors, he was quiet, awkward, and even polite. But behind the walls of his small Milwaukee apartment, he was hiding a nightmare so disturbing, it shocked the entire world. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in West Allis, Wisconsin. From an early age, people noticed something unusual about him. As a child, Jeffrey was painfully shy, often withdrawn, and struggled to connect with others. But what stood out the most was his obsession with death. While other children played with toys, Jeffrey collected animal bones. He dissected roadkill, stored carcasses in jars, and spoke about preserving skeletons. At first, adults dismissed it as curiosity, but it was more than that. It was the foundation of a darkness growing inside him. His family life didn't help. Jeffrey's parents had a turbulent marriage, filled with arguments, neglect, and emotional distance. His father, a chemist, was often away, and his mother battled depression and instability. Jeffrey felt abandoned, isolated, and unwanted. By high school, he was drinking heavily to numb the emptiness. In June of 1978, just weeks after graduation, Dahmer's darkest urges surfaced for the first time. He picked up 18-year-old hitchhiker Stephen Hicks, inviting him home for a drink. When Hicks tried to leave, Jeffrey panicked. He struck him with a dumbbell, strangled him, and dismembered the body. It was his first kill, and once Jeffrey crossed that line, there was no turning back. For nearly 9 years, Dahmer didn't kill again. But he wasn't reformed, just repressed. During this time, his fantasies grew stronger. He experimented with drugs, pornography, and violent fantasies. And by 1987, his cravings returned with full force. That year, Dahmer lured 25-year-old Stephen Tuomi to a hotel room. After drugging him, Jeffrey woke up to find Stephen dead beside him, beaten to death. Dahmer claimed he had no memory of doing it, but instead of reporting the incident, he purchased a large suitcase, stuffed Tuomi's body inside, and transported it back to his grandmother's house where he lived. There, he dismembered the corpse and disposed of it. It was the beginning of a killing spree that would last 4 years. From 1987 to 1991, Dahmer lured young men, mostly gay men and boys of color, back to his apartment. He promised them money, alcohol, or simply companionship. Once inside, he drugged their drinks, strangled them, and performed unspeakable acts on their bodies. Dahmer's crimes escalated quickly. He engaged in necrophilia, dismemberment, and cannibalism. He preserved skulls, kept organs in jars, and stored flesh in his refrigerator. To his twisted mind, these acts weren't about cruelty. They were about possession. He didn't want his victims to leave him. In his words, he wanted to keep them forever. By 1990, Dahmer's one-bedroom apartment, number 213 at the Oxford Apartments, had become a chamber of horrors. Neighbors complained of foul odors seeping through the vents. Jeffrey explained it away as spoiled meat or exotic fish. But in reality, it was the smell of death. Inside, police would later find vats of acid filled with dissolving body parts, human skulls stacked in a closet, and freezers stocked with severed limbs. Over time, Dahmer admitted to killing 17 people. Some of his youngest victims were just 14 years old. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect was his attempt to create human zombies. He drilled holes into the skulls of his victims and poured in acid or boiling water, hoping to create a living, mindless companion. Every attempt failed, and each one ended in death. But despite the horror happening inside his apartment, Dahmer's crimes went unnoticed for years. Police had multiple chances to stop him, and missed them. One of the most infamous incidents occurred in May 1991. Dahmer lured a 14-year-old boy named Konorak Synthasamphone back to his apartment. The boy was drugged and injured, but managed to escape, stumbling into the street. Neighbors called police, but when officers arrived, Dahmer convinced them it was just a lover's quarrel. The boy was returned to Dahmer's custody. Within an hour, Dahmer killed him. Later, investigators discovered that had the officers looked inside the apartment that night, they would have found photographs of corpses and the remains of other victims. But Dahmer's reign of terror came to an end just 2 months later. On July 22, 1991, Dahmer approached 32-year-old Tracy Edwards and invited him back to his apartment with promises of money and alcohol. Inside, Edwards noticed something was wrong. There was a terrible stench, strange blue barrels, and a power drill lying on the floor. Dahmer attempted to handcuff him, but Edwards resisted. At one point, Dahmer pressed a knife to his chest and told him he planned to consume his heart. In a desperate act of survival, Edwards waited until Dahmer was distracted, then punched him and ran out the door. He flagged down 2 police officers who followed him back to apartment 213. What they found was beyond comprehension. Polaroids of dismembered men, skulls painted and arranged like trophies, a freezer containing severed heads, a large drum filled with decomposing remains. The nightmare was finally exposed. Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested that night. During his interrogation, he confessed in chilling detail, describing each murder, the cannibalism, and his failed experiments to keep victims alive. He showed no emotion, speaking calmly about acts so depraved they shocked even hardened detectives. In 1992, Dahmer stood trial. The courtroom was packed, the world watching. His defense argued insanity. The prosecution argued he was fully aware of his crimes. After weeks of testimony, the jury found him sane and guilty. He was sentenced to 16 consecutive life terms in prison. But Jeffrey Dahmer's story did not end in prison. On November 28, 1994, after just 2 years behind bars, Dahmer was beaten to death by a fellow inmate named Christopher Scarver. The man who had inflicted unspeakable horrors on others died violently, his skull crushed with a metal bar. Jeffrey Dahmer's case remains one of the most infamous in criminal history, not just because of the number of his victims, but because of the sheer brutality of his acts. 17 lives stolen, 17 families left in agony, and a chilling reminder that evil can hide in plain sight. The quiet neighbor down the hall, the man who shops at the same grocery store, the face that seems ordinary but masks something monstrous. Jeffrey Dahmer was called many things: the Milwaukee Cannibal, the monster of Milwaukee. But perhaps the most terrifying truth is this: he looked human, and he lived among us. Never forget the victims. Never forget their names. And remember, the darkest monsters are not always the ones we imagine in nightmares. Sometimes they live right next door. The Backpacker Murderer, Ivan Milat. Between 1989 and 1993, 7 young travelers disappeared along a popular backpacker route in New South Wales, Australia. Months, sometimes even years later, their remains were discovered in the remote Belanglo State Forest. The man responsible? A road worker named Ivan Milat. a name that would forever be linked with one of Australia's darkest chapters. Ivan Robert Marco Milat was born in 1944, one of 14 children in a working-class family. He grew up in Sydney, part of a large but often troubled household. By adulthood, Ivan worked as a road worker and was known for his love of hunting, knives, guns, and the bush. He was skilled with tools, weapons, and four-wheel drives, and he knew the back roads of New South Wales like the back of his hand. On the surface, Milat appeared ordinary, but behind closed doors, he harbored disturbing interests, and those would eventually turn deadly. On September 19, 1992, two orienteers running in Belanglo State Forest stumbled across something horrifying, a human skull and bones. The very next day, police discovered another body just 30 meters away. The victims were identified as Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters, two young British backpackers. The scene was brutal. Joanne Walters had been stabbed repeatedly. Caroline Clark had been shot multiple times, execution style. It even appeared that Clark had been used for target practice. Investigators knew immediately this was no accident. They were hunting a killer. A year later, in October 1993, the horror deepened. Another bushwalker discovered human remains in a different section of Belanglo. Police found two more victims, James Gibson and Deborah Everest, both from Melbourne. Gibson had been stabbed multiple times, his spine severed by a deep wound. Everest had been beaten and stabbed. Oddly, Gibson's backpack and camera had been found years earlier, over 100 kilometers away in Sydney. This meant the killer had deliberately moved evidence, taunting investigators. But the nightmare wasn't over. Soon, 3 more victims were uncovered. Simone Schmidl, a German backpacker, and a German couple, Anja Habschied and Gabor Neugebauer. Each had been last seen hitchhiking south from Sydney. All 7 victims had been buried in shallow graves, covered with sticks and ferns. Many showed signs of restraint, stabbing, or shooting. And chillingly, items of their property were missing, likely kept by the killer as trophies. By late 1993, panic had spread among travelers. Hitchhiking routes emptied as the murders dominated headlines worldwide. The New South Wales Police launched Task Force Air, a team of more than 20 detectives using maps, databases, and forensics to track the killer. Thousands of potential suspects were examined. That list was narrowed to just a few dozen. But then, a critical piece of the puzzle arrived from overseas. In 1990, 3 years before the forest discoveries, a British backpacker named Paul Onions had reported a terrifying incident. While hitchhiking near Belanglo, he accepted a ride from a man who called himself Bill. During the drive, Bill pulled out a gun and ropes. Paul escaped by running into traffic and flagging down a motorist. His report at the time had been misplaced. But when Paul saw news of the murders years later, he contacted police again. He flew back to Australia, looked at a lineup, and immediately pointed to one man, Ivan Milat. By early 1994, Milat was under surveillance. Police knew he owned a four-wheel drive similar to vehicles seen near the murder sites. His work record showed he was free during the times of the killings. On May 22, 1994, police raided his home. Inside, they found a chilling cache, firearms and parts matching those used in the murders, camping gear, and clothing that once belonged to the victims. The evidence was overwhelming. Milat was arrested and charged with 7 counts of murder. In 1996, his trial began. The prosecution presented a mountain of circumstantial evidence: the weapons, the victim's belongings in his possession, and the testimony of Paul Onions. The defense suggested other family members could have been involved, but the jury didn't buy it. After months of testimony and over 140 witnesses, the verdict was delivered: guilty on all counts. Ivan Milat was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences without parole. Even behind bars, Milat never confessed. He maintained his innocence until his death, refusing to acknowledge the victims or their families. In 2019, he died of cancer in prison, taking his secrets with him. But questions remain. Some investigators believe Milat may have killed more than the 7 known victims. At the time of his arrest, police linked him to as many as 30 other unsolved disappearances across New South Wales. To this day, no one knows the true number. Belanglo Forest, once just another stretch of bushland, is now forever associated with horror. Travelers still leave flowers and memorials for the 7 young backpackers whose lives were cut short. The backpacker murders changed how Australia viewed hitchhiking, how police handled serial investigations, and how quickly missing person reports are taken seriously. But above all, this story is a reminder of the victims. 7 lives full of promise, ended by one of Australia's most infamous killers.